Hello and welcome. I'm Court Booth. I'm here with Alan Cathcart, and today in our By the People series, we're going to talk with Alan about life in the Water and Sewer Department and how Alan's role as Superintendent of Water and Sewer is something that affects our lives, the quality of our lives every day, and contributes to the betterment of the town and all the citizens within it. So I want to welcome you, Alan. Thanks for joining us here at the CCTV studios.
Thank you, Court. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to the ratepayers of Concord Water Sewer, who probably have the most interest in what we do and what we're about.
Well, I'll confess and apologize. Maybe we take the good work you do for granted sometimes, on the assumption that pure water comes in the tap and wastewater goes out the back of the house or the apartment. And somehow, magically, this occurs every day, and yet you're here to tell us, no, it's not magic. There's some engineering and science to it, which we'll learn a little bit about. I want to start, however, with a story. True story. I moved to Concord some years ago and immediately noticed a change in the taste of the water. Of course, I'd come from another town in Massachusetts and had the Concord water and thought, this tastes different to me. And so I didn't feel confident because different meant I didn't trust it. So I called I don't know if I went through townhouse or not, but at any rate, then reached your office and had two big surprises that day. Number one was I got a visit within about an hour and a half from somebody in your department who said, we take these seriously. Let's check out your water. And he was at my kitchen sink and took the sample and did his on-site testing and said, this was surprise number two. He said, Mr. Booth, I want to tell you, you have perfectly good, in fact, excellent pond water here. And I was shocked. I thought, I didn't know I was drinking pond water. So let's start there. Where does our water come from?
Sure. Well, first, I'm very pleased that you had that kind of responsiveness. That's one of the things that Concordians have certain expectations, being responsive, to our customers. I will say that first and foremost, the water and sewer system is your system. We're charged to manage and operate and control it, and we respect that. So whatever we do is with the mindset that you are the owner. We're here to try and provide these services, information. The whole idea of pond water in the industry, we call it surface water. It's just a different term for the same source. Concord, through the evolution of our system, first started with surface water supply exclusively because basically it's hydraulics. It's looking for large sources of available water which have to travel some way through some power to an area that has the need. If you go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, when systems were being developed, municipal systems or community, the source of power was gravity. So you'd have to look at topography, lay of the land, identify surface bodies that could feed a lower area. So Concord actually realized the first surface water was in Lincoln at Sandy Pond. And somewhere that was in the 1800s. In 1909, they expanded the system to include Nagog Pond, which has become very topical recently for Concord and Acton. So they exercised rights in Nagog, and both systems fed via gravity to the town of Concord. In the 50s, as there was economic growth and development, post-war development, new neighborhoods were being developed. There was increased demands and needs, and the town then started looking at other sources which were inclusive of groundwater supply. So the pond aspect is basically we can fingerprint where you are in the system based on the chemistry and the testing. So the observation at your home was it looked and had the fingerprint of the surface water, which would have been Nagog Pond. Other parts of town may be primarily fed with groundwater supplies, and we could actually tell that by just looking at the chemistry. Though the bottom line is we do rely on both groundwater supplies and surface water supplies. We have total 7 sources of supplies, which is fantastic, but increasingly we find as demands increase, we are leveraging each of these sources more and more, which brings us to the evolution of NAGOG, where we are now moving forward with the design and ideally construction of a full-scale filtration facility for that site.
You have a major undertaking there right now, correct?
Sure. Yeah.
Can you speak to that? What's going to happen over there? And what decision-making has Concord done to enable that? What decision-making has Acton done to enable that?
Well, it all begins in 1884. There was a legislative act that granted Concord the right to the waters of Nagog Pond, and we have, over the more than 100 years, realized that right through actually developing the source, installing the infrastructure to bring the water from Nagog to the town of Concord in 1909. In 1930s, we procured land, or took land in Acton that was just downstream a bit for eventually to install a filtration facility. Even in the 1930s, there was awareness that that was the technology of the day. It provides just greater opportunity if there's changes in water quality where you can mitigate. In 1950, we installed a pump station on Route 2A in Acton to allow high-pressure pumps to pump the water into Concord, into our storage reservoirs. And in 1996, we installed an ozone facility, which was enhanced disinfection. So generally, a lot of people may notice, or sometimes they talk about a chemical taste in their water. And unfortunately, it's a reality that in order to disinfect water and maintain a residual, which is that, sometimes you can taste that, that's to protect the water so it can be consumed. And there's lots of questions that come, why do we need to disinfect the water? But basically that is a standard practice, a best management practice for the industry that's been better part of 100 years for disinfection. We installed ozone in 1996, was enhanced disinfection utilizing new technology to improve the water short of full-scale filtration. So that's the history of Nagog Pond. Since 1996, we haven't leveraged Nagog Pond as much as we had in the past, and the reason was we had a waiver, a federal waiver for this filtration facility. I will note MWRA is a system much like Concord, only on a much larger scale, that does not have filtration. Seattle, Washington is a large system that does not have filtration. They get by with ozone and a chlorine in order to disinfect the water, because the water is of high quality. And if it's high quality and protected, and we protected Nagog Pond since we initially took the rights in 1884 and developed the source in 1909, we've done a very aggressive campaign on protecting the resource, ensuring development didn't occur around it, and preserving it. But in this day and age, we're realizing some of the emerging contaminants of interest and concerns, we'd be better suited to actually go and install a full-scale filtration facility, which is what we've been involved with through design, piloting. When you install a new facility, you look at the latest and greatest technology that's available. Things evolve. So there's a process that is in place today that didn't exist in the 90s. So we're able to leverage this technology, reduce the footprint of our facility, reduce some of the costs associated with the structures involved. And we started piloting 3 or 4 years ago. And that then moved towards a design and preliminary design, which is where we are now, which involved permitting of a facility before we go to final design and construction. So it's been a 4 or 5 year window of, sort of, I consider it sort of that the overnight success, the garage band. yeah, they've been playing together 10 years, but now they're out actually performing. We've been working on this for a long, long time, and a lot of people are just starting to come to realize, well, yeah, we're aware of this, but they may not be realize of what it's taken to get to this point. And it's very deliberate and strategic as far as how we proceed with a project of that scale.
Where do the various permitting agencies step in on this to allow us to bring in this water and depend on it more than we have in the past, I imagine?
Sure. There are many aspects to the permitting. Some include state controls and authority, where you can go through a MEPA process, which is a macro environmental review, and that's the macro review. We participate with the Department of Environmental Protection for the piloting. If you're going to look at in design and constructing a facility, they want to be involved, so you'll submit an application to demonstrate what you're doing to pilot. They will participate and receive reports on the piloting to see, is the technology right? Is there any innovative technology? There is the local permitting, which would go through Acton, because it's in the town of Acton. The pond itself borders Littleton and Acton. The facility and where we want to construct it is in Acton, so we go to the town of Acton. What's interesting with Acton is because we have a municipal use in another municipality, it complicates things, and hence you end up with interesting zoning requirements. And so we are going through what they call a special permit, for a site plan. And in Acton, when you have a special permit, it's kind of unique. It goes through the select board. Mm-hmm. So they're one entity that we've been working with in Acton. Another entity we've worked with in Acton is the Conservation Commission. Two primary components that we're looking at for infrastructure is replacement of a 1909 intake pipe that goes out hundreds of feet into the pond, where the water actually gets taken into a treatment process. So that involved the Conservation Commission in Acton. We went through that process and got a notice of intent approved. We're now in the process with the the select board in Acton. Those hearings lasted the better part of a year. There was a lot of interest in Acton. There's a lot of concerns that have been raised through the hearing process, and some of them are, very legitimate, and some of them are, based on sort of feelings and emotions and impacts to people who are immediately abutting this proposed use. And a lot of these people who are immediately abutting this have really, there's some developments occurred just within the last 5 years, and they seem to have identified and they weren't unaware of, Concord's interests and needs to design and construct this facility, which has raised some concerns and challenges to Concord as far as what we're doing and why.
You mentioned the term protection. Is protection mostly in the form of trying to reduce human activity near and around water sources, or what other forms does it take?
Primarily, it's land use controls and access to the pond. Part of our design for this new facility is to shore up the protection, including some fencing as part of this process to protect that land that has been taken for water supply purposes exclusively. And that has raised some ire in the town of Acton that has been voiced at the hearing.
Is there any adverse impact on Acton's water by virtue of Concord tapping into and now adding the filtration to Nagog Pond?
Sure, that's another question that has been raised through this deliberative process through the select board in Acton. And it's interesting with water and water rights. We see that Concord simply is realizing rights that it believes it has as far as access and use of a supply. And basically, a lot of discussion went on in the 80s to determine what's appropriate, what are the rights, and that became a baseline for water rights. So we had legislation from 1884, and then we had a Water Management Act, a state act, to impose some controls on withdrawals and allowances for communities. And I'll say Concord was there and present and utilizing Nagog Pond. So that was something that we have as a registered source at that time. Okay. That gives us certain rights to continue to do what it is we're doing. So this discussion on what is changing or new or different is interesting to us because basically we've played by all the rules that exist.
In your professional opinion, is our waste and misuse higher than average for a town like ours? Are we not really conscious of good conservation practices? So that's number one. Mm-hmm. Are we wasteful in your opinion? Number two, with the summer season approaching, it's conservation awareness time for you, I imagine. Sure, yeah. Therefore, for us, those of us who live here, so what's going on in terms of public education and how you're trying to manage the withdrawal side of things?
Last summer was an interesting time across the state where we had, it's difficult to actually put a number or quantify and rank this, but we had a significant drought. There was no question. People at home realized it. You could look out the window, you could see it was hot and it was dry and there was very little rain. That precipitated a lot of interest statewide as far as what are we doing community to community as far as managing and addressing this drought. And drought has many manifestations. It's not just drinking water or water supply, it's fire protection, it's agriculture. There's different concerns that are identified when the state gets involved with declarations that relate to dry, extended periods of dry weather. What we realize is, it's kind of fascinating, I used Worcester last year has a large reservoir and they were drawing down. I'm going to say this because people need to understand a frame of reference. Climate and weather are two different things. And people's understanding of wet times and dry times are relative. Worcester had been drafting off MWRA because their reservoir was being depleted, and so they were supplementing with MWRA. So that was an agreement and a contract and a cost. Ironically, at the time, this was because of this extreme drought. During this extreme drought, there were flash floods that occurred. So the weather had sort of, what have you done for me lately? It's very wet. And these storms came, so on one hand, they have a drought system problem, and they had areas of their collection system that was submerged because of flash flooding. So with that said, this past summer became an opportunity for a lot of people to realize, well, what's not working with their particular drought management plan? It was a severe stress test. And what we found in Concord is, and we talk about wasteful water, water is becoming increasingly expensive. And in fact, what's interesting is historically, you talk about sort of out of sight, out of mind, water and wastewater. Fortunately or not, we're becoming more and more visible. We're more and more a player at the table, whether it's economic growth and development or impact on a customer and what we're doing as far as wastewater capacity challenges or drinking water quality or how much you can use. It's no longer just, we're fine, leave us alone. Because we have to speak to these larger permit issues, we've been doing more and more to manage and mitigate and ideally eliminate waste, because waste by definition is not intended use by anybody's interest. So you use the water and it's not being used for something that actually benefits you, that's waste. And we've been spending years trying to promote best management practices, particularly in outdoor watering, because that's where we see the most significant opportunity for waste. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of water used for outdoors that are deliberate and intentional. So you come to a community like Concord, people move here for a certain quality of life. There's lots of open space, there's lots of land area for residents and properties. There is an interest to maintain your property. So people have different ideas as far as what is essential or non-essential use, and you'll hear that term more and more. We try not to judge that. We just try to make sure people understand if there's waste, what can we do to help you minimize that, because it's a cost and a cost of the town collectively. And what we found last summer is when it became a serious drought, we really did need people to curtail their water use. We leaned on a bylaw that was established in the 90s for which allowed the Public Works Commission to make certain declarations to protect the supplies and ensure that we can provide safe, reliable drinking water and fire protection to everybody in Concord. So they had to exercise some of those controls. What we found is we had developed something called a seasonal demand management plan, which was supposed to be an easy way for people to look at this matrix and understand when there's a certain declaration, these are the uses that are allowed, these are restricted, and these are what are prohibited. And what we found is that it wasn't very effective. The messaging was challenging, the understanding was challenging, the compliance was challenging, and like any bylaw or regulation, there are actually enforcement teeth as well. There's no way to really enforce it in a way to ensure that if you're abiding by these restrictions and your neighbor isn't, that the fairness issue became a real challenge.
Imagine that as a homeowner, I do want to comply.
Mm-hmm.
What are the best ways for me to stay informed? What do we need to do, and how are we going to know from the water department?
We've retooled and revised the seasonal demand management plan, ideally to allow for a more streamlined, clear communication. People need to understand the focus historically has been on outdoor water use, and that can mean many things to many people. And outdoor water use could be anything from maintaining your garden, planting trees, maintaining a lawn, fountains, filling of swimming pools, you name it. Those are all outdoor uses. What we have come to realize is that really the challenge in Concord, or the opportunity, is to put more controls in lawn watering, and lawn watering specifically with in-ground irrigation systems. And I will tell everybody out there that an in-ground irrigation system I see is a significant luxury, not because of just the cost, because it allows you to use and manage water very efficiently or not. The problem is most people do not manage their in-ground irrigation system. And what we find routinely are people who use a lot more water than they ever imagined, and they don't know why. All we know is it went through the meter, and we have many calls where there's thousands of dollars of use that people can't explain. I'm telling you, an in-ground system, if it's not properly maintained, is a huge liability as well. They are shallow depth, they're only 6 inches or a foot buried. You have heads that are there seasonally. That's the frost zone. That's an aggressive environment. When we put in water services, they're buried 5 feet. So it's a fairly fragile system which people can use. And if they're used and maintained properly, can be effective. But our focus has now been on lawn watering, and we are trying to dovetail with some of the state policies that are really being pushed by a lot of special interest groups that really don't like anybody using water outdoors, or they really want to restrict it. I'm not judging it because I deal with the customers, sure. But if my interest is different things, fish flow, stream levels, that sort of thing, then you really don't have a lot of patience for people using water for what you would consider non-essential. So we're trying to shadow what the state is doing policy-wise, and that's why sitting in these committees, I know where they're going. The state is looking at fairly crude metrics of if there's an advisory, drought advisory, and it could be based on weather over the past 12 months, not just what's happened in the last 3, sure. There will be a restriction. I know the state has presently identified Concord in the Northeast region in the state declarations as advisory condition. These special interest groups would want that to dovetail with 1 day a week mandatory lawn watering. We, with our retooling of our seasonal demand management plan.
1 day mandatory maximum.
Maximum.
Got it, okay.
That's the beginning. And fairly quickly we get to the point where there will be no outdoor watering. We've retooled this matrix here, and it's identified, and you'll see sort of there's a green, yellow, red, and gray. Green is where we're in what we consider best management practices. We don't believe 1 day a week is best management practice for lawn watering. We believe 1 inch a week is, and if people Google this and do their research, they're going to find this out. And they're going to ask us, what's this 1 day a week? And I'm going to tell them it's a state directive, not a town interest. With that said, it is advisory. There are no enforcement metrics. It's just basically an awareness, and our focus, at least in the foreseeable future, is on lawns, not on ornamental flower beds or gardens or washing your car or filling your swimming pool. We don't believe that has a significant impact, but in Concord we believe lawn watering does. So if you abide by the 1 inch per week, and you can use smart technology with your irrigation system, have it serviced, we think you can have a good lawn and not be compromised and be efficient. If we find we don't get the response we need through operations, we would ratchet up. We'd go into a yellow, and that's where restrictions would then be enforceable. And it's very similar to the advisory. The difference is we can now take action through the bylaw, and we're being asked to by what we found last year with residents saying, I'm doing my part, what's wrong with my neighbor? Sure. They expect us to follow through for fairness. And so that 1 day a week is going to be tethered to, and this is new, and that's why it's important people understand this, basically it'll be the same route that municipal trash collection occurs, so that people understand their day of the week will coincide with that municipal trash pickup day.
Keep it easy. If we're watering on a day other than that, stop.
Stop. Yeah. And we will be able to some degree, police and enforce that. And technology is going to allow us to do more and more with time. So that becomes an ability to be a little bit clearer as far as what the expectations are, the focus. You'll see signs out where it might say, starting seasonal water conservation advisory, best management practices. When you get to lawn watering restriction, you will see that sign. It'll be clear what that is. Last year we had water emergency. Yeah. It meant many things to many people. So we're clarifying that it's a lawn watering restriction. All the other activities are allowed to some degree. You can look down the matrix and get the details. And we get into the red zone, that would be lawn watering ban. And again, the message is clear, restriction versus ban, but it's lawn watering. That's our target, and we believe that if people can get familiar with this, we encourage you to go to the town website, where any of the outreach that we do, and this is town-wide, and what I'm finding is people are more interested in getting notification of things at their convenience. The town has a really a wonderful program where you can go on to the concordma.gov, and through there's a way of getting to a website where you can opt in to getting notices on various town departments and activities. And if you go there, we will, anytime there's a change in a condition that we would ratchet up or down for that matter, we will send out a news and notice. And if you subscribe, you'll get that ping, you'll see where it goes. There'll be a link to our matrix. From the matrix, there'll be helpful hints and things where you can go, links to understand a little bit more what you can do depending on what use you're interested in. And really our interest has never been enforcement. In fact, last year, I'll note, we sent over 400 letters to customers as a heads up, as a courtesy. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how Concord works, and that's how we expect to work. We're really not here to be the water police. The challenge is statewide, increasingly becoming more and more of a, what's the program? So we are going to be challenged with developing a program that's clear and effective and fair, and that's what we're working on.
Well, by way of bad pun, I'll say we've only had time to dip our toe in. There's a great deal to this, and I think what you've done, among other things, Alan, is made clear that you're looking out after multiple stakeholders when it comes to water, not just me, the homeowner, but there's a lot of players in this game. It's not simple. I want to thank you, Alan Cathcart, Superintendent of Water and Sewer. So again, thanks for joining us at CCTV.
Thank you for the opportunity to explain, and if people have specific questions, please call the office and our staff will be able to help you and give you some guidance. Thank you.